Women forced to marry all the men of the family, the most cruel tradition of consanguinity. In the isolated mountains of Tennessee, between deep valleys and dense forests, there were communities that developed customs as disturbing as the isolation itself that surrounded them. This is the history of the Caldwell family, whose marriage practices have created one of the most genetically committed lineages already documented in the southern United States. The year was 1912, while the world watched the wreck of Titanic and President William Howard Taft led his campaign for re-election in the mountains. A way of life completely oblivious to modernity unfolded. Hidden between the valleys, Caldwell had a tradition that dates back to generations. Family women were intended to unite with multiple men of the same clan, creating a web of consanguineous relationships that challenged all social and biological norms. Evelina Caldwell was only 16 years old when she became the protagonist of this obscure chapter of American history. Born in a rustic cabin in Hancock County, she grew up without contact with the outside world, educated only on housework and peculiar doctrines that her grandfather, Silas Caldwell, imposed as absolute law. Silas, the patriarch, was a 67-year-old man whose wrinkled face and severe look revealed both the years of hard work and a distorted moral intransigence. With a grey beard that came to the chest and hands calling on the work on earth, he ruled his family with unquestionable authority. His justification for the practice of consanguinity was as simple as disturbing. The blood of the Caldwell must remain pure, without mixtures. What is born on the mountain belongs to the mountain. Family property stretched for about 200 acres of mountainous land, with 6 rustic huts spread across the terrain, connected with dirt trails. There lived approximately 30 family members, all descendants of Silas and his late wife, Sarah. Isolation was not only geographical but also ideological. Children did not attend schools, and contact with strangers was strictly forbidden. Tradition established that, upon reaching appropriate age, Caldwell women should first join the older men in the family other than their direct father, usually an uncle or cousin of the first degree. Then, progressively, they would become wives of other family men in a hierarchy determined by age and position in the clan. The consequences of this practice were evident in the faces of the younger ones. Children born in these unions often had visible physical deformities, prominent jaws, low forehead, very close eyes, cast fingers, and significant intellectual deficiencies. When it came to Evelina, the young, light, brown-haired and melancholy eyes had a limited understanding of what her family duty meant. His mother, Martha, had been through the same ritual, and now, at 35, looked like a 60-year-old woman, consumed by hard work and multiple pregnancies. Martha had given birth to 8 children, of which only 3 survived, Evelina and her 2 younger brothers, both showing clear signs of cognitive disabilities. The first husband designated for Evelina was his uncle Ezekiel, brother of his father, a 45-year-old man with violent temperament and precarious hygiene habits. The ceremony, if it could be called that, happened on a full moon night, with all family members gathered around a fire. Silas, as a patriarch, led the ritual based on a distortion of the biblical scriptures and invented traditions, legitimizing what any external society would consider a violation. Evelina did not shed a tear during the ritual. His face, illuminated by the fire of the fire, showed a resignation that went beyond his age, the same empty look he had observed in his mother and aunt's eyes. Inside Ezekiel's cabin, where it would now be forced to live, there was only a bed of straw, a rustic table, and a few chairs. The walls, made of poorly adjusted trunks, let the cold wind come in the cracks. What no one knew at that moment was that, unlike other women in the family, Evelina had had a brief contact with the outside world. 2 years earlier, during a rare trip to the nearest city to sell farm products, she had talked to a local teacher who, realizing her situation, had secretly gave her a book. For months, Evelina had learned to read hidden, absorbing ideas that showed her that there was a reality beyond the mountains. While the other family members celebrated with homemade liquor, Evelina kept a seed of resistance within themselves. Under the straw mattress, hidden in a cloth bag, was the book that his perspective was changed, a collection of stories about women who had challenged the conventions of their times. On the horizon, the clouds accumulated, foreshadowing a storm. The cold wind that descended from the mountains carried the smell of rain and the distant sound of thunder. It was as if nature itself reflected the inner whirlwind of Evelina. What no one could predict was that this young woman would trigger events that would eventually expose Caldwell's practices to the outside world, leading to the disintegration of generations of isolation and consanguinity. Check it out if you are already registered with this channel. You need to know these real stories that reveal the darkest secrets of humanity. Stories that no one else has the courage to tell, but we all need to know. Evelina's first weeks in Ezekiel's cabin established a standard she feared that would last for the rest of her life. Wake up before dawn, prepare breakfast, work in the garden, wash clothes in the nearby stream, cook, clean, and obey the demands of your husband when he returned from the long hunting or work hours in illegal still in the property caves. Ezekiel was not a man given to conversations. With almost 3 decades more than Evelina, he treated her as an acquired property, not very different from the tools he used to cultivate the land or the animals he kept in the small corral behind the cabin. His face perpetually burned by the sun, and his calloused hands revealed a hard life of hard work. But his eyes, too small, a common feature in the family, had a coldness that made Evelina tremble. During this period, Evelina carefully observed the standards and routines of the family. Caldwell women, although subjugated, had established a silent system of communication and mutual support. At times, when they gathered to wash clothes on the stream or spoon vegetables in communal gardens, they exchanged significant looks and hasty whispers, sharing small survival strategies. Evelina's aunt Judith, a 42-year-old woman whose curved body and prematurely aged face told the story of a life of deprivation, became her reluctant confidant. On an October afternoon, as they collected apples in the small orchard, Judith explained in a low voice the reality that Evelina would have to face. After Ezekiel, Jeremiah's shift will come, and after Jeremiah, the young Isaac, when he turns 18 in the spring, explained Judith, his constantly vigilant eyes to ensure that they were not being observed. That's how it works here. Grandfather Silas says that this way the blood stays strong, but look at the children, ... Look at my children. Judith had 4 living children, from different family husbands. The oldest, a 15-year-old boy named Eli, could barely speak and had difficulty performing the simplest tasks. His asymmetrical face, with one eye visibly larger than the other and a misaligned jaw, was a silent testimony of the effects of continued consanguinity. Silas does not allow us to see anything wrong with that, continued Judith. He says that the difficulties of children are trials sent by God, not the result of our family arrangements. It was at this moment that Evelina decided to share her secret with Judith. At night, when Ezekiel went to a meeting with other family men in the still, Evelina showed her aunt the hidden book and revealed that she knew how to read. "There is a world out there, Aunt Judith," whispered Evelina, the pages of the book illuminated by the weak light of a candle. "A world where women are not forced to marry their own relatives, where children go to school and are not born, as they are born here." The winter from 1912 to 1913 was particularly severe in the mountains. The snow is even more isolated the ownership of Caldwell, making the already rare trips to the city completely impossible. Inside the cabins, illuminated only by fireplaces and sebum candles, the family survived with foods preserved during the fall: smoked meat, pickled vegetables, cornmeal and apples stored in the basement. It was during this winter that Evelina found that she was expecting a child. The news, which in other circumstances could bring joy, filled it with a deep terror. She had seen family born in the family. Many did not survive in the early months, and those who survived often had serious problems. Playing her still flat barrier, Evelina made a decision. She needed to escape before her son was born in that environment. The plan began to take shape during the long winter nights. With Judith's reluctant help, Evelina began storing small amounts of food, hiding them in a hole under the cabin's floor. She also separated some pieces of clothing, and, more, I am important. He began to study the rudimentary maps designed in the book he had, trying to understand how he could navigate the mountains to the nearest city. The biggest challenge would be to avoid being recaptured. The Caldwell family had connections with other isolated mountains communities, and Silas had made it clear over the years that desertions would not be tolerated. Soached stories among women spoke of previous escape attempts that ended in tragedy. The opportunity arose in early spring of 1913. With the melting of snow, the men of the family organized a 3-day hunting expedition, seeking to refuel almost empty pantry after the long winter. All women were left on the property, with strict orders to prepare gardens for planting. On the morning of men's departure, Evelina embraced Judith in a silent goodbye. The aunt, with tears in her eyes, pressed a small package in her niece's hands, some coins saved over years, hidden in a flap of fabric. "Go to the east, following the stream course," instructed Judith. "After 2 days of walking, you will arrive in Rogersville. Look for the Methodist church. The pastor there is a good man. He will help you." That night, under the protective cloak of darkness, and with only the crescent moonlight to guide her, Evelina Caldwell left behind the only life she had known. Carrying a small muggle with food, some clothes, her precious book, and the coins given by Judith, she left the forest, following the stream course as instructed. What she did not know was that her escape would trigger a series of events that would eventually lead to the complete exposure of Caldwell family practices, resulting in one of the first documented investigations into consanguinity in the isolated communities of Appalachia. His 3-day mountain journey would only be the beginning of a much greater transformation, not just his own life, but from the lives of all women and children left behind. As he walked through the dark forest, his hand instinctively over his belly, where a new life grew, Evelina felt something she had not experienced for years: hope. Evelina's trip through the mountains was harder than she could have imagined, used only with Caldwell's immediate surroundings. She found that the world beyond was simultaneously wider and more dangerous than her books had suggested. During the second day of her journey, a heavy rain soaked and ruined her provisions. Hunger and exhaustion dominating his body, Evelina found shelter under a rocky protrusion. It was there, shaking as she tried to light a small fire, which she experienced the first moment of true despair. "What if this child is better if I come back?" he whispered to herself, her protective hands on her belly. "What if we die here in the mountains?" The thought of returning to Ezekiel's cabin, of submitting again to the system he had fled, caused a chill to go through his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. No, it decided firmly. Any destination would be preferable to this one. With renewed determination, Evelina continued her journey as soon as the rain decreased. At dusk on the third day, exhausted and hungry, she finally spotted Rogersville's first houses. The small town, with its dirt streets and modest buildings, looked like a metropolitan center compared to the isolation in which it had lived. With dirty and torn clothes, tangled hair, and bare feet bleeding from the cuts suffered during the walk, Evelina attracted looks of distrust and pity while heading to the city center, looking for the Methodist church that Judith had mentioned. The church was a simple, white, painted wood building with a modest belfry and a small cemetery next door. As Evelina approached the door, her legs finally gave in to tiredness, and she fell to her knees on the steps of the entrance. This is how Reverend Thomas Wilson found her, a pregnant young woman, semi-contest of exhaustion, murmuring inconsistently on escaping the Caldwell. The Reverend, a middle-aged man with grey hair and kind eyes behind round glasses, didn't need much explanation. He had heard rumors about the isolated families in the mountains and their peculiar practices, although the complete extent of what happened remained a mystery to most of the city's inhabitants. "My wife will take care of you," he said kindly as he helped Evelina enter the parish house adjacent to the church. "You're safe now." Martha Wilson, Reverend's wife, was a practical woman with experience in nursing. She dealt with Evelina's injuries, fed her with hot soup, and set her in a clean bed, simple luxuries that the young woman had not experienced for years, if Al-Gumar had experienced. In the following days, as he recovered his forces, Evelina gradually told her story to Wilson. The couple heard with increasing horror the details of life on Caldwell property, forced unions among close relatives, children born with disabilities, the absolute control exerted by the patriarch Silas. "What you call marriage is not recognized by the law," explained the Reverend Wilson carefully. "What was done with you and other women is considered a crime in this state." The idea that the practices that had known all his life was not only morally questionable but illegal was revealing to Evelina. For the first time she really processed the abnormality of the life she had left behind. If you are feeling your stomach turns around with this story, leave in the comments just as to Evelina. It is important that stories like these be known so that such atrocities never happen again. Meanwhile, on the Caldwell property, the return of men from the hunting expedition had triggered a crisis. The absence of Evelina was immediately noted, and Ezekiel, humiliated and enraged by the desertion of his young wife, required retribution. Silas, the patriarch, organized a search for property and surroundings, but Evelina's trail had already been erased by the rain. It was Judith who, risking her own security, suggested that Evelina had probably died in the forest, taken by hunger or wild animals. The suggestion, although macabre, temporarily satisfied the fury of men, who soon turned their attention to more pressing issues, such as the preparation of the earth for spring planting. In Rogersville, as the weeks spent, the presence of Evelina in the parish house began to generate curiosity in the small community. Reverend Wilson, concerned about the possibility that Caldwell eventually discover his whereabouts, contacted a friend in Knoxville, a doctor named Dr. James Harrington, who was interested in consanguinity studies and their effects. Dr. Harrington arrived in Rogersville on a May afternoon, bringing with it medical equipment and a sharp scientific interest in Evelina's history, as one of the early doctors in Tennessee to formally study the genetic effects of consanguineous unions. He saw in the fugitive young woman an opportunity to document a case that until then existed mainly in medical theory. "What you describe," he explained to Evelina during his initial exam, "is an extreme endogamy system, far beyond what is usually even seen in isolated communities. The fact that multiple men of the same lineage, joining the same women exponentially increases the risks to offspring." Examining Evelina carefully, Dr. Harrington noticed subtle characteristics that suggested generations of consanguinity, slightly shorter than normal, a specific curvature on the jawline, and eye spacing. Although Evelina was one of the fortunates that had no serious problems, the signs were therefore trained eyes. "Your baby," he said cautiously, "at all significant risks. I can't predict for sure, but modern science suggests that children born to so close unions often develop serious complications." The news, though not completely unexpected, devastated Evelina, curating her now visibly protruding belly. She wondered what kind of life could offer a child who would potentially face challenges from birth. It was Martha Wilson who comforted her that night, sitting on the edge of her bed while silent tears ran the young woman's face. "You have already shown more courage than most people demonstrate in a lifetime," said Martha, holding Evelina's hand. "Regardless of what happens, you won't be alone." In June 1913, with his advanced state making it impossible to hide his presence, the story of Evelina reached the ears of the local sheriff. Concerned about the legal implications and the possibility of retaliation of Caldwell, the sheriff Thomas Jenkins made a formal visit to the parish house. "Reverend," he said, removing his hat as he entered, "I heard disturbing rumors about a sheltered young woman here, fleeing a situation unusual in the mountains." What followed was a long conversation in which Evelina, with the support of Reverend Wilson and Dr. Harrington, reported his experience. The sheriff, a man of rigid but righteous principles, was visibly disturbed by the account. "Miss Caldwell," he said finally, "what you describe are serious crimes according to Tennessee laws. If you are willing to give a formal testimony, I can start an investigation." The decision Evelina faced was monumental. Officially denouncing family practices would mean not only exposing Silas and the other men, but also bring unwanted attention to the women and children who were left behind. On the other hand, remaining silent would mean allowing the cycle to continue indefinitely. That night, alone in her room in the parish house, Evelina opened her worn book, the spark that had lit her journey to freedom. Among his pages, He found the courage he needed in the history of women who had changed not only their own lives, but the lives of others around them. The next morning, with a firm hand on a Bible in the sheriff's office, Evelina Caldwell made her formal testimony. What she did not know was that her words would begin one of the first official investigations into forced consanguinity in the United States, eventually leading to changes in state laws on marriage and child protection. While summer advanced and its delivery date approached, Evelina alternated between moments of fierce determination and absolute terror. The future, previously so rigidly defined by the limits of Caldwell property, now opened before it, vast, uncertain, and despite all the challenges, finally yours to determine. One muffled morning of July 1913, Evelina's labor began. Martha Wilson, with her experience as an informal community midwife, prepared the back room of the parish house with hot water, clean towels, and the medicinal herbs she used to use to relieve childbirth. Dr. Harrington, who had extended his stay in Rogersville specifically to accompany the birth, arrived shortly after the first signs, bringing his medical suitcase and a countenance of professional concern. The work of delivery was long and difficult. For over 20 hours, Evelina fought through increasingly intense contractions, her young and relatively healthy body working to bring to the world a child whose destination was marked by generations of choices that were not yours. "You're going very well," encouraged Martha, cleaning the sweat of Evelina's forehead with a damp cloth. "Take a deep breath, as I showed you." In the early hours of the next morning, with the first rays of sunshine filtering through the lace curtains, a girl was born, but with a surprisingly strong cry that filled the room. Dr. Harrington immediately examined her, her experienced eyes looking for the signs she feared. The relief on his face was visible when he finally wrapped the newborn in a clean blanket and handed it to Evelina. "She looks healthy," he said, allowing himself a rare smile. "We will need to observe it carefully in the coming months, but for now you have a strong daughter." Evelina looked at the small red, wrinkled face, feeling a wave of protective love so intense that she almost took her breath. The baby's eyes, though still turned and poorly focused, seemed to look straight at her with an intensity that made her heart squeeze. "Hope," whispered Evelina, gently touching her daughter's soft cheek. "Your name will be Hope." The choice of name was not accidental. Hope represented everything Evelina had risked her life to find, and everything she wanted for her daughter's future. While mother and daughter rested, the world beyond the walls of the parish house continued to move. The investigation began by Evelina's testimony had grown in scope and urgency. Sheriff Jenkins, initially skeptical of the extent of the allegations, had gathered enough evidence to justify a higher operation involving county officials and even a representative of the state prosecutor's office. One August morning, when Hope was only 3 weeks old, a delegation of 5 armed men, led by the sheriff, left towards the mountains where Caldwell property was located. Its mission was double: to investigate the allegations of forced and illegal unions, and to verify the well-being of women and children who still lived under the control of Silas. What they found exceeded Evelina's descriptions. The property, seen in the light of the official investigation, was revealed a microcosm of misery and degradation. Cabins, built precariously and in advanced deterioration, housed women with empty looks and children with visible deformities. Silas maintained records a bizarre combination of family tree and lineage control that remembered the breeding of animals more than human relations, provided irrefutable evidence of the forced consanguinity system that had persisted by at least 4 generations. Silas Caldwell, confronted with official authorities for the first time in his long life as a patriarch, reacted with a mixture of religious outrage and incoherent threats. When the sheriff presented the arrest warrant, the old man tried to resist, just to be subdued quickly. "What we do here is sacred," he shouted as he was driven out of the property. "Blood must remain pure. You have no right to interfere with God's laws." Ezekiel and the other adult men in the family were also detained, accused of various crimes from illegal relations to child abuse. Women and children, many seeing people from outside the family for the first time, were temporarily allocated in a makeshift shelter in the city, while the authorities tried to determine the next steps. The news of the Caldwell family and its practices soon spread beyond Rogersville. Newspapers in Knoxville and even Nashville published sensational reports about the cologne of consanguinity discovered in the Tennessee mountains. The case quickly became a point of discussion for social reformers, doctors interested in genetics, and legislators concerned with gaps in existing laws. For Evelina, now established in a small room at the back of the general goods store where she had got a job as a helper, attention was simultaneously validating and disturbing. On the one hand, the public exposure of family practices meant that the authorities could not simply ignore the situation. On the other hand, sensational reports often portrayed all Caldwell, including women and children, such as degenerate mountains, ignoring the complex reality of victims and perpetrators. "They treat us as animals on display," commented Evelina bitterly to Martha Wilson during one of her weekly visits, while Nineveh Hope in her arms. The same people who pretended not to see what happened in the mountains for decades now want to examine our lives as if we were specimens in a laboratory. The trial of Silas Caldwell and other family men began in October 1913. The county court was packed beyond capacity. Curious from neighboring cities traveled hours to witness what the newspapers called the mountain judgment. Evelina, convened as the main witness of the prosecution, faced her biggest challenge until then. Dressed in a simple blue dress borrowed by Martha, she walked to the bench of witnesses with fixed eyes ahead, refusing to look to the side where Silas, Ezekiel, and the other men in the family were sitting. When he finally lifted his eyes, he found Silas's gaze, a look not of regret or shame, but of pure fury. The silent message was clear. She had betrayed her family, exposed her secrets, challenged her authority. 4 hours. Evelina answered the prosecutor's questions and then endured the hostile interrogation of the defense attorney, a man hired by a local church that believed the case represented improper government interference in family affairs. "Miss Caldwell," asked the defense attorney, a thin man with a thin mustache and calculating eyes, "is it not true that you were never legally married to Ezekiel Caldwell? That in fact there was no civil ceremony recognized by the state?" "There was no legal ceremony," answered Evelina firmly. "There was a ritual led by Silas, based on their own interpretations of the scriptures, and you voluntarily participated in this ritual, right?" Evelina felt a warm up her neck to her cheeks. "I was 16. I was created believing I had no choice. It was my duty." Duty to whom, exactly? Stop with the family. Stop with blood, as Silas always said. The lawyer smiled coldly. And yet, when you decided that this duty no longer invited you, you simply fled. You abandoned your family. Before Evelina could answer, the prosecutor got up to protest. Very merit, the witness is a victim, not an accused. The judge, an elderly man with a face marked by deep wrinkles of expression, nodded. Protester accepted. Lawyer is restricted to the relevant facts for this case. Despite the hostility of the interrogation, Evelina's testimony, supported by the records found on the property and medical report of Dr. Harrington on the conditions of Caldwell children, was devastating to the defense. In late November, after 3 weeks of testimonials, the jury returned with the verdict: culprits. Silas Caldwell was sentenced to 15 years in prison for multiple violations of state marriage laws and coercion. Ezekiel and the other men received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. Caldwell women and children faced a different destination. With the property confiscated by the state and without subsistence means, they were temporarily allocated in various charities. Younger children, especially those with serious shortcomings, were sent to Irish state institutions, a destination that, although different from the isolation in the mountains, rarely offered much better conditions in America from the early 20th century. Judith, who had risked everything to help Evelina escape, eventually managed to settle on a small farm on the outskirts of Rogersville, where she worked as a washerwoman for local families. Her children, including Eli with her special needs, remained with her, a rare victory in a story marked by so many losses. For Evelina, the end of the trial brought a temporary relief, but not the closure that it expected. The nights were still often interrupted by nightmares, where she was back in Ezekiel's cabin, unable to escape. In the days when he visited the market, he occasionally realized his eyes and whispers that followed it, a mixture of morbid curiosity and silent judgment. "You will always be that Caldwell girl," had said Martha Wilson kindly, but also with realism. "Not for us, but for many in the city. Maybe it's time to consider a new beginning, somewhere where your name and your story do not precede it." The suggestion planted a seed in Evelina's mind. As hope grew, becoming a pink-cheeked girl with brown curls and a smile surprisingly free from any shadow of the past, Evelina began to consider the possibilities besides Rogersville. It was Dr. Harrington who finally offered the opportunity she needed. Having returned to Knoxville after the trial, he continued his study on the effects of consanguinity, now with a special interest in Hope's development. In one of his regular visits, he brought a proposal. The University of Tennessee is establishing a special program to study the genetic effects of various conditions, he explained. They need an administrative assistant, someone to organize files, transcribe notes, that kind of thing. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays reasonably well and comes with campus accommodations. Evelina, now 18 years old and with her almost a year-old daughter, saw in the offer more than a simple job, was a chance to rebuild her life in an environment where her story, though not completely forgotten, would not be the only defining factor of her identity. In January 1914, with Hope in his arms and a small suitcase containing all his belongings, Evelina embarked on the train to Knoxville. Looking out the window as the mountain landscape slid away, she felt a complex mix of emotions. There was sadness for women and children who could not escape, determination to build something better for his daughter, and a growing sense of purpose that had begun like a simple escape, but was now turning into something bigger. The Caldwell case, though far from unique, had exposed an obscure reality that many would rather ignore: the human consequences of generations of isolation and consanguinity in the remote communities of the Appalachians. The work that Evelina would do at the university, although modest in scope, would contribute to an understanding that would eventually help prevent stories like yours. As the train gained speed, moving away from the shadows of the mountains toward the city's lights, Hope slept peacefully in her mother's arms. His future, unlike so many Caldwell children before her, was not predetermined by an inescapable cycle of isolation and consanguinity. Whatever life reserved for her, Hope would have what her mother had risked everything to get: choice. Knoxville, 1923. A decade had passed since Evelina Caldwell had left the mountains with her newborn daughter. The city, while still modest by the standards of the great American metropolises, seemed a completely different world from the isolated slopes of the Appalachians. The University of Tennessee campus, with its red brick buildings and majestic oaks, had become home of Evelina and Hope. What had begun as a temporary position of administrative assistant had evolved over the years, Evelina demonstrating keen intelligence and knowledge thirst that decades of isolation had not been able to suffocate. Eventually gained a position as an assistant researcher at the Department of Social Studies and Doctors. Hope, now 10, was a remarkably healthy and bright child, without any of the physical or cognitive signs that had marked so many children Caldwell, with wavy brown hair framing a living and expressive face. She had inherited her mother's perceptive eyes, but did not carry the shadow that often darkened Evelina's gaze. That specific afternoon, mother and daughter walked the campus, taking advantage of the heat of the beginning of the fall. Hope, dressed in a simple blue dress and polished shoes, held the arm of their mother while talking. "Mum?" Hope asked, her clear voice cutting the afternoon. "Why, Doctor? Harrington always examines me so carefully during our visits. I'm not sick." Evelina looked at her daughter, carefully considering her answer. Over the years she had faced the question of how much and when to tell Hope about her origins. The girl knew only fragments: that her mother had come from the mountains, that her father was not part of her lives, that somehow they were special for Dr. Harrington's studies. Dr. Harrington is a scientist who studies how families pass parents to children, Evelina explained, choosing their words carefully. "You help you understand important things that can help other children." Hope considered this for a moment, her young face serious with contemplation. "Is it because of my father? Why was he a relative of yours?" Evelina stopped walking, feeling like the air was sucked from her lungs. In all the scenarios I had imagined for this conversation, I had never considered that Hope could already have deduced parts of the truth on her own. Where did you hear this?" he asked, his voice more shaky than he would like. Hope shrugged, with the typical direct frankness of childhood. "I heard Dr. Harrington talking to Professor Wheeler about the Caldwell case, and how I was a remarkable example of genetic resilience despite parental consanguinity." I looked for the word in the dictionary. Evelina felt a mixture of pride in her daughter's intelligence and despair for not being able to protect her from this truth longer. Guiding Hope to a bench under an oak, she sat down and pulled her daughter close. "There are parts of our story that I was hoping to share with you when I was older," Evelina started. "But you were always more insightful than I expected." In the following hours, sitting under the oak, while the fall of the fall filtered through the golden leaves, Evelina told a simplified but honest version of her history. He talked about the Caldwell family in the mountains, how they lived isolated from the world, about traditions that forced relatives to marry each other, and their escape to give Hope a different life. Hope heard with an intensity that seemed beyond her years, occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions. When Evelina ended, the girl remained silent for several long moments. "So that's why we don't have other relatives," he said finally. "And that's why you never wanted to go back to the mountains." "Yes," answered Evelina gently. "But I want you to understand something very important. What happened doesn't define who you are. You're your own person, Hope. Always will be." Hope nodded slowly, processing everything she had heard. Then, in a movement that brought tears in Evelina's eyes, the girl leaned and hugged her mother firmly. "You were very brave, Mum," whispered. "As in the stories you read to me before bed." That conversation marked a turning point in the relationship between mother and daughter. With the secrets of the past now partially revealed, a new honesty flourished between them. Hope, with her natural curiosity, now fed by fragments of her family history, began to ask more questions, not just about Caldwell, but about consanguinity, genetic, and the studies in which she and her mother had become an integral part. In 1925, when Hope was 12 years old, Evelina's work with Dr. Harrington culminated in a significant academic publication, Generational Effects of Continuous Consanguinity, a case study of Appalachius. The study, which maintained the anonymity of the subjects but detailed the genetic and social patterns observed in the Caldwell family and similar families, became an important reference in the emerging field of behavioral genetics. For Evelina, the publication represented a complete transformation from a silent victim to active contributor to scientific knowledge that could eventually help prevent situations like she had faced. It was also during this period that Evelina received an unexpected letter from Rogersville. Martha Wilson, who had remained a faithful and corresponding regular friend over the years, wrote with news that they reopened old wounds. Silas Caldwell had died in state prison at the age of 80. "I thought you would like to know," wrote Martha, "that before his death he asked to speak to a chaplain. No one knows what was said in that final conversation, but the chaplain later commented that even the harder heart may eventually face his own truth." The news aroused in Evelina a storm of contradictory emotions. There was no forgiveness in his heart to the man who had perpetuated generations of suffering, but there was a strange sense of closing ration. The letter also featured news about other Caldwell women. Judith, who had remained in Rogersville, had established a small informal community for some of her family's ex-wife, who had been able to rebuild her lives after the trial. Together, they operated a small laundry that had become a modest but stable business. "They talk about you often," wrote Martha. "For many of the younger women, you have become a kind of legend, the girl who escaped and changed everything. Some even sent their daughters to school, inspired by what they heard about you and Hope. The idea that his escape had somehow opened the way to other women was simultaneously humiliating and strengthening for Evelina. The cycle that seemed so unbreakable had been, if not completely broken, at least significantly weakened. In 1928, when Hope turned 15, the same age that Evelina was when she started planning her escape, mother and daughter made an important decision. It was time to revisit the past, literally. The trip back to Rogersville and eventually even the old Caldwell lands was not easy. Each kilometer traveled by the train seemed to take Evelina more deeply in memories that had worked hard to soothe. But beside her he was Hope, strong, confident, curious, a living memory that not all stories are condemned to repeat their darkest chapters. Martha Wilson, now a widow of white hair, but with the same kind look, received them at the season. The reunion was exciting, with long hugs and tears that spoke more than words could express. "You have become a remarkable woman," said Martha, holding Evelina's face between her wrinkled hands. "And this must be Hope. My God, she has her eyes." The visit to Judith and the other women Caldwell was equally exciting. In a small house converted to the edge of the city, Evelina rediscovered women who had shared her childhood and youth, faces that carried the weather marks, but also a new dignity that had been absent on property days. "You have paved the way," said Judith, now a middle-aged woman with grey hair and work calloused by work. "After you fled, something changed. It was as if you had shown it was possible." The hardest time of the trip was the visit to the lands that once belonged to Caldwell. Abandoned after the trial, the property was now partially covered by the vegetation that claimed the space where the cabins had been. Evelina walked slowly for what had been the center of the property, Hope respectfully a few steps back. Stopping where the main cabin of Silas had been, Evelina felt a tremor go through her body, not of fear or anger, but of a strange sense of liberation. "This place has no power over me anymore," she said finally, turning to look at her daughter. "Not even you will never have." Hope, who had been quiet for most of the exploration, approached and took her mother's hand. "What happened here? It's part of our history, but it's not our future." On the trip back to Knoxville, sitting side by side on the train, while the mountain landscape gradually gave way to the plains, Evelina reflected on the extraordinary journey she had traveled, not just the physical distance from the mountains to the university, but the transformation of a scared young woman without formal education in a woman who now contributed to scientific knowledge and social change. Most importantly, she looked at Hope, healthy, intelligent, with a bright future in front of her, and saw the real measure of her. Victory against the Caldwell marked consanguinity cycle. In 1930, Hope Caldwell became the first of her lineage to enter the university, deciding to study medicine focused on genetics, a choice directly influenced by her own history. Evelina, now a respected researcher and occasional speaker on the social and medical effects of community isolation, watched with inexpressible pride as her daughter traced a path that would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier. Evelina's work, combined with the studies of other researchers inspired by her case, eventually influenced changes in state laws on consanguineous marriage and the way the authorities dealt with isolated communities. Instead of sensationalism or negligence, a new approach began to emerge, one that recognized the complexity of these situations and sought interventions that protected the vulnerable while respecting the dignity of all involved. On a fall afternoon of 1932, 20 years after his mountain escape, Evelina Caldwell was sitting at her university office, reviewing even grades to a lecture, when he received an unexpected visit. A young woman, visibly nervous and carrying a small child, knocked shyly at her door. "Mrs. Caldwell?" asked the hesitant visitor. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I came from a community in the Kentucky mountains. They told me you could help me." Looking at her young mother's anxious face, Evelina saw a reflection of herself 2 decades earlier, scared but determined to break a cycle that had trapped generations. With a kind smile, she invited Sarah to come in and sit. "You have already taken the first and hardest step," said Evelina, her calm and firm voice. "And yes, I can help you. We can help each other." While the fall sun spotted a golden light through the office window, illuminating the hopeful face of the young mother and her son, Evelina felt a deep sense of purpose. The story of the Caldwell, its story, had not ended in Tennessee's isolated mountains. He continued through every woman who found courage to break cycles of abuse and isolation, through each child who was born with the opportunity to define her own destiny. The most cruel tradition of consanguinity had been broken, not just for a family, but potentially for many. And in this, Evelina Caldwell found her true liberation. Check it out. If it is already subscribed to this channel, it is extremely important that stories like these are known so that we can protect future generations from practices that cause so much human suffering. If you watched so far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Do not forget to leave your like and share with someone who needs to know this obscure reality that existed in our society. Together, we can guarantee that such practices remain only on the pages of history.